Hey guys, welcome to another episode of Journey of an Average Gamer, Minecraft Edition. In today's episode, we're going to be going over dyes. Now, dyes come in 16 different colors. So what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to go over each one of the 16 types of dye, and I'm going to show you how to obtain the items needed to create those dyes. And then once you actually have the dyes, what you can actually do is use the dyes to change the color of certain objects and certain items, so that way it gives your world its own unique color and flair. So if you actually look at the second row and the third row in my Minecraft world, all of those various color items come from dyeing the base object with a specific type of dye. Now when it comes to the second row and the third row, I'm gonna make videos for those to go in depth, but I just wanted to show you an example of some of the things that you can do once you learn how to dye and obtain dye. Now, the first type of dye that I'm going to explain is going to be the white dye. And just like anything else, white is going to be kind of like a base. So, to get that white dye, there's three ways we can actually do it. So, I'm going to go to my table. And the first thing we're going to do is find the mob spawn, which is the skeleton, and kill a whole bunch of them. When you kill a bunch of skeletons, they're going to drop bones. And you can convert those bones into bone meal. Bone meal is good because it can be used as a white dye. Also, bone meal can be used to fertilize your crops so your crops can grow faster. So I like to use bone meals when it comes to harvesting trees for lumber. But the bone meal is what you're going to use as a white dye. The second type of item that we can use as a white dye is actually white dye itself. So not only bone meal can be used to dye things colors, but you can use this bone meal and convert it to the actual formal color white dye. So we just turned our bone meal in that we had on hand into 6 white dyes. Now the second way we can actually get white dye, the third way we can actually get white dye is by finding the lily of the valley. Now if you've been exploring your Minecraft world, there's going to be an area called the plains, and in the plain there's going to be a variety of flowers growing in the plains. So this right here, as you can see, is going to be the lily of the valley. And if you take the lily of the valley and go into your crafting table, you see we no longer have any bone meal, but yet we can still construct dyes. And as you can see, we're constructing them out of that lily of the valley. Now we have 10 white dyes between the bone meal and the lily of the valley flower. That's going to be how you're going to obtain your white colored dye. The next color dye we're going to talk about is the black dye. The black dye can be derived from 2 different sources. One, you can get it from the ink sac, and that ink sac is actually going to come from the black squids that you find in the ocean. So what you can do is use those and turn them into a bunch of black dyes. The next one that we're actually going to be using is going to be the wither rose. Now the wither rose comes from the wither, and anytime the wither kills an enemy, it has a chance of dropping a wither rose, which can be helpful because mobs will hurt themselves. It's kind of like walking through a cactus. So again, the second item that we can use, the wither rose, to get the black dye. So that's going to be 2 for black, the ink sac and the wither rose. All right, the next color dye that we're actually going to go over now is going to be brown. Now there's only one source you can actually source for the brown dye, and that's going to be the cocoa beans. So cocoa beans, they grow on jungle trees in the jungle biome. So what I did was I took a couple of jungle logs, jungle logs, and I got some cocoa beans, and this is going to be kind of like my mini cocoa bean farm. Now what you're going to want to do is break it up. You see how you have 2 cocoa beans that popped out? I'm going to put one of those cocoa beans right back on there, and eventually over time that cocoa bean is going to grow. So that's going to be how we harvest the cocoa beans. But what I'm going to do is just grab a couple so I can make some dye. Now I have 4 cocoa beans. I go over to my table, and with the 4 cocoa beans, we can now create brown dye. So now we have 4 brown dyes from those cocoa beans. Again, cocoa beans are the only way you can get brown dye. So you're going to want to find a jungle biome, and you're going to want to start a cocoa bean farm, so that way if you want to use a lot of brown dye, then you know how to harvest that. Now the next dye we're going to be exploring with is going to be the red dye. Now the red dye is very abundant to get, and it'll probably be the first ones you kind of max out on. And the reason being is that there's 4 items that you could convert into red dye. The first one right here is going to be the rose bush. We can actually take the rose bush and convert it into dye. The next one is going to be the poppies. You can take these red poppies and convert them into dye. Also right here, that's going to be a red tulip. And I need more red tulips, but red tulips do convert over into red dye. And last but not least, the 4th item that transforms into red dye is going to be the red beets, the beetroot. Now, if you have like a beetroot farm, then you'll be able to harvest the red dye at a faster rate than any other of these plants here. So that's going to be the 4th dye that we actually. The 5th dye we have on our list is going to be the yellow dye. Now the yellow dye can be derived from only 2 actual items. One is going to be this, the sunflower, and 2, the dandelion. So once you break the sunflower and the dandelion, you can go ahead and convert them into yellow dyes. And those are the 2 items that can be converted into yellow dye. All right, the next dye we're going to actually have on our list is going to be the green dye. Now you can only get green dye from one source, and that's going to be the cactus. So if you go into your desert biome or go to a area where there's a random sand block towards the end and it's connected to the river and there's a stack of cactus right there, go ahead and take that, and you can also mine it just like how I'm mining cactuses right here. I also have another cactus mine behind me, but this is going to be the nuance. Now, unlike the others where we can just go ahead and go to our crafting table and craft the dye, this one actually has a small little nuance, and that's going to be we have to actually smelt the cactus into green dye. So once the furnace finishes smelting the cactus, which is taking forever, we're going to be left with a piece of green dye. Now again, this is the only way we can actually obtain the green dye is by smelting the cactus. And that's going to be it for the green. Okay, now the 7th dye we're going to be considering is going to be the blue dye. And this is going to be the last of our base colored dyes. And I'll explain what I mean in a little bit. So the blue dye is going to be derived from 2 things. Either 1, this cornflower, and 2, lapis lazuli. So these are going to be the 2 ways that we can derive blue dye. Now, as you can see, I can convert this lapis into blue dye. Now, lapis may be a little bit harder, not harder to come by, but a little bit rarer than the flower. Now, all of your flower-based dyes, if you actually pick them up and create a little garden, you can use the bone meal in order to, multiply and grow those items. So you could continuously farm the flowers. Lapis lazuli, you can either trade that, get that in a trade, or you're going to have to mine it, which is going to be a little bit more time consuming. So if you need blue dye, your best bet is to take these cornflowers and use the bone meal in order to harvest more and farm that. So again, cornflower and lapis lazuli are the 2 methods that we're going to get the blue dye for. Now, all the other colors are going to be combinations of these base colors, these 7 base colors that we just went over. And I'll explain that right now with the gray dye. The first of our blended colors is going to be the gray dye. Now, in order to get the gray dye, what we're going to have to do is we're going to have to go to our crafting table, and we're going to actually take the white dye and the black dye that we just harvest and turn it right here into gray dye. Boom. So that's going to be the first of our blended colors. Now the light gray dye can actually be harvested 6 different ways. So this new color, light gray, we can actually use 2 white dyes and 1 black dye to create light gray dye. You can use 2 bone meals and 1 ink sac in order to make light gray dye. And then when it comes to the actual flowers, you can actually take this flower right here, the oxydaisy, the white tulip, and the azure bluettes, and you can actually convert those into light gray dyes, as I'm going to show you now. Right? See how you got the oxydaisy? Boom. And then you have the azure bluettes. We can convert those into light gray dyes. The two white dyes and one black dye can convert. And there goes that white tulip. We can convert that. So that's going to be how we're going to obtain our light gray dye. The next here on our list is going to be the orange dye. Now there's two ways you can get the orange dye. One, you can get orange tulips from the plains and convert that into orange, or you can take the red dye and the yellow dye and convert it into an orange, as you can see here on my crafting table. So I'm going to follow the crafting table. So that's going to be one red dye versus one yellow dye in order to create the orange dye. Now the next one again is going to be the orange tulip that you can find in the plains, and I just converted that. So now I have 33 orange dyes, and that's going to be how we get the orange dye. The only two ways to get the orange dye. The next on our list is going to be the lime colored dye. Now, just like the green dye, it follows the same nuance. So you can get green dye from three different ways. One, you take green dye and a white dye, blend them together, and you get the lime green dye. You can use the green dye and the bone meal. And the third way we can actually harvest the lime is going to be by smelting a sea pickle. So if you've ever been to a tropical biome and you dig underneath it, there's going to be these little brown little candle things. That's going to be the sea pickle. So you can harvest a couple of those, or you can wait for the wandering trader to come around and trade for a sea pickle. I'd rather go into a sea and harvest a sea pickle and save my emeralds. So what you do is you take the sea pickle, put it in the furnace, play the Jeopardy theme music while it takes forever to smelt. And that's how we're going to get the lime colored dye. And we can now add that to our collection. Now this next dye, the Cheyenne colored dye, is going to be created two different ways. One, you can take a green dye and a lapis lazuli and create a Cheyenne colored dye, or you can take the blue dye and mix it with the green dye. So since I don't have any lapis on me, I'm just going to take the blue dye and the green dye, as you can see in the little crafting formula, to create the new Cheyenne dye. And that's going to be how you get that color dye. The next on our list is going to be the light blue dye. Now the light blue dye can actually be harvested 4 different ways, but there's only going to be one flower way. So you can take the light blue and get that by blending a lapis lazuli and the white dye, and that'll lighten up that blue and turn it into a light blue. You can use the lapis and the bone meal. You can also use blue dye and a bone meal. But the only one that you can use as a flower to grow the flower version, instead of having to search for the lapis, which is a little bit difficult, what you can actually do is get this, what's called the blue orchid. And that's this flower right here. Now you can find a lot of blue orchids in swamp biomes. And not only that, but you can actually use bone meal in order to harvest and farm more of these light blue dyes. So what we're going to do is, since we already have the other raw dyes, and this is the only one that's going to be different, what I'm going to do is take these 64 blue orchids and convert them into 64 light blue dyes. And that's going to be how you get the light blue dye. So remember, you're going to need a lot of bone meal, because the flowers that you can actually derive the base colors from, you can actually use the bone meal in order to help them grow and to multiply and farm that way. So save up your bone meal. The next dye to use is going to be the purple dye. Now the purple dye isn't going to be difficult. Just like we learned in school, red and blue makes purple. So you can either take a red dye and a lapis lazuli and turn it into a purple dye, which in my opinion, you want to save as much of your lapis as possible since they're not as abundant. And what you can do is take the red dye and the blue dye to make it purple. And these are going to be the 2 different ways to actually harvest purple dye. So I'm going to go ahead and harvest some purple dye, and that's going to be it. So now I have 16 purple dyes by mixing the blue, and the red colored dyes. Remember, conserve your lapis lazuli. Alright, the second to last color we're going to actually harvest is going to be the pink colored dye. Now, when it comes to pink colored dye, we can get that one of 4 different ways. We can either take red dye and bone meal and mix them together. You can either take red dye and white dye and blend them together. Or you can get pink straight up from the source, from the flower source, which you're going to actually harvest these pink tulips and these pink peonies. So we're going to go ahead, hit those up. And then first we're going to take the peonies and turn them into pink dyes. Now, as you can see in our crafting table, we have the pink tulips we can convert into pink dye. And I'm just going to go ahead and finish those off. But as you can see on the crafting table for the formula, you can mix that red dye and that white dye. So because the red dye and the white dye is so abundant that you can get them in abundance, a lot of times, most of the time, you probably won't use the flower arrangements in order to harvest them. You'll probably just blend the two of the red and the white dyes. So those are going to be the 4 different ways you can actually get pink dye. Now, last but not least, when it comes to the magenta dye, we can get that one of 5 different ways. One, we can take purple dye and pink dye and put them together to make that magenta dye. You can either take blue dye, white dye, and red dye and mix all 3 together in order to get the magenta. Or you can blend the pink dye, the blue dye, and the red dye to get the magenta colored dye. Now, when it comes to the actual flower that you can derive the dye directly from, there's going to be these 2 right here, the lilac and the alum flowers. So what I'm going to do is harvest each one of those and go to my crafting table. Now, as you can see, the first one on the crafting table that's going to be allotted is going to be the lilac. So I'm going to go ahead and 99 of those. And the next one is going to be the flower, the alum. So I'm going to convert that into magenta dye. And that's going to be it. So those are going to be the 5 different ways to actually get all 5 of the magenta dyes. And yeah, so now we can actually use these dyes to make nice crazy designs. And in the next video, what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you how to get an achievement while using these dyes. So guys, I hope you enjoy the video. Like, comment, and subscribe.